Hi everyone, my name is Albert Świdziński. Welcome to another Strategy and Future podcast. And with me today is our old guest and our colleague at Strategy and Future, Nicholas Myers. Just to introduce, I'm sure many of our listeners and our audience know who Nick is, but let me just remind everybody. Nick is a postdoc fellow at Naval War College. And again, longtime associate of us. So thank you for being here today, Nick.
Thank you for having me. I'll say up at the beginning that the views that I express today are not necessarily those of the United States, the U.S. Naval War College, or the Department of the Navy, but I'm here to talk in my own capacity, which means that can be interesting.
I have to say, I always enjoy those caveats being introduced in conversation. It somehow adds gravitas to what we're about to discuss. But
I'm pretty sure that's the reason why they enforce that rule, is that everybody feels really cool when they have to say it.
But that's a serious guy right there, yeah. But okay, Nick. So let me start with this. We're actually recording on 21 months into the war in Ukraine. Actually, exactly on that day, the war has begun 21 months ago. And, truism to say it went through different phases, certainty that Ukraine will fall, then a wave of euphoria. Now it seems at best, approaching stalemate in this conflict. And I also remember very early on when we did our recordings February, March, April 22, we did our recordings where you would discuss the outlook on the battlefield. And I remember in one of those recordings, you said that by now everybody assumes that any future conflagration in Eastern Europe will look exactly like war in Ukraine. But it might, I guess the corollary was that it might not necessarily be the case. So seeing how the war progressed, how the West is dealing with problems with material production, industrial capacity, how do you see how do you see this? How do you answer? Can you answer this question by now, or give some basic, guidelines?
So perhaps the most interesting way of thinking about the war in Ukraine at the moment is just how little has actually revolutionarily changed in terms of the operational way of warfare for if you look back over the past 100 years or so. So 100 years ago, just over 100 years ago, we hit a point at which the notion where the superior military is the one with better organizational skills, the ability to actually move around on the battlefield, was evaporated in the First World War and became a question of who is able to shoot more things effectively while concealing one's own position. And that era of warfare is apparently still with us. The major source of what many people, including myself, thought was going to be revolutionary about future warfare before 2022 was that the proliferation of precision missiles that can be fired from quite a long way away would be able to produce an asymmetric effect. What we've seen by now is that at least in the presence of high motivation on at least one side, and on this war, I think the motivation's actually been reasonably strong on both sides. Higher on the Ukrainian one, but I don't think it's like this is 100 versus 0 on this. It doesn't actually have a magical effect. It essentially can reduce the efficiency of units, but these units learn to adapt relatively rapidly. We are actually gathering a lot of lessons in the West now from talking to Ukrainians who have experience rebooting their entire computer system regularly, restarting things with new commanders after the previous one was assassinated, all sorts of things of that nature. And it's one of those things that, from the perspective of a peacetime military, it looks like this should be a huge deal. But once you become used to it, the war can just continue more or less forever, as long as the motivation and the material continue to be present. So in that regard, perhaps the most important thing here is to see that when we're thinking about the future of warfare, we still, at least for the next couple of decades, need to be thinking about it in terms of how are we getting to the enemy being in a position to feel sufficiently vulnerable that they have to negotiate in order to survive, or that negotiation is superior to continuing to suffer. And that the function for how that's going to work within battles themselves is still going to be how do you conceal your own position and avoid exposure while eventually needing to get to the other side. So, in that regard, it looks as though the defensive has gained the advantage in this war, but I don't actually think that it's as definitive as it would have initially seem. I think the major problem that both the Russians and the Ukrainians have faced throughout this fight is that both sides have been impatient for victories at various points. And as a result, they can't really retain initiative for long periods of time. Both sides seem to believe that there is something to be gained by essentially attriting themselves into no longer being able to move practically at all in order to actually advance, or at least prevent the other side from undoing recently gained results. This is in line with Russian military thinking for a long period of time. It's one of the tenets that I perceive in the Russian military in the long term is that in peacetime, they're always planning for how to execute wars at an almost unthinkably fast scale. And in wartime, they focus overwhelmingly on how to hold stuff that they've managed to take from the enemy. So that transition has pretty much entirely occurred within the Russians over the course of the past 21 months. The Ukrainians seem almost to be of the same mind at this point. They did not expose themselves perhaps as much as a lot of Western advisors wanted them to during the counteroffensive, which was the original reason why we heard people like General Milley expressing disappointment with what was going on. You can look through both Ukrainian and Russian public statistics, no matter how much they are inflated or propagandized, and you'll see that the days in which the Ukrainians were seriously doing breakthrough attempts were extraordinarily few, even within the context of them supposedly doing this large-scale counteroffensive. And in none of them did it actually succeed. There were a variety of times where the Ukrainians did make major advances through minefields, but then by the time that they're ready to start engaging with the Russians, they had sufficient attrition that they had to break the attack at that point, and then the Russians are able to refix the line to a certain extent. Again, this is logic on military logic that's been persistent for the past 100-odd years of when you're trying to do a breakthrough in a fixed position, you need to first suppress the enemy from being able to see what you're doing over a prolonged period of time while you're advancing. Second, be prepared to actually start shooting your way through a bunch of trench lines, and then work on holding your peripheries while you're actually moving through enemy defenses. And third, as the offender, you are racing against how fast the other side is able to move reserves to plug up where they now perceive the attack to be coming from. Now, what's curious here is that on both the Russian side especially, but the Ukrainians somewhat less so, the reserves don't appear to be all that large. The Ukrainians do have, I said the Ukrainians have an advantage on that front, but not a huge one. But we didn't really see the need to just move reserves rapidly in order to plug these things up. So, as a consequence, I'm fairly skeptical that we've actually seen much breakthroughs in Serbian lines, no matter how many times I saw headlines over the course of the summer saying, oh yeah, it's just about to happen, or it has happened at the following points, or we're about to see major breakthroughs going on. I think the major problem we have here is that in the absence of domination of the air domain by either side, there's simply no capacity to actually hold down the sufficient suppression for a long period of time, as well as holding flanks within a specific area where a breakthrough is being attempted for the lines to move. Instead, what we are seeing is that as interest deteriorates at certain points of the line, because commanders on both sides are focused primarily elsewhere, we can get to the point where there are very, very small-scale movements. But especially with these most recent Russian advances, this appears more likely to be they noticed that a trench line was especially weak. They managed to seize it, that they didn't continue over because they know that there was no point in continuing to take casualties going there. I would suspect that a lot of these Ukrainian small chunks that they were gaining in the south over the course of the summer are more or less the same story. So yeah, long
So,
rambling answer to
uh-huh.
get you started there.
Sure, but it's interesting because when we discuss this and at Strategy and Future, well, really others discuss. I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed in general, but especially when it comes to operational art, the general idea seems to be that maneuver on the battlefield has very much stalled out precisely because you cannot concentrate force, right? Because you cannot really conceal it, because there is abundance of sensors, which basically make it prohibitively costly to to concentrate, right? And especially that you have electronic warfare, which puts a premium on defense, right, rather than offensive movement. But you say it's not necessary because then there is, of course, there are other very interesting things which I hope to discuss later, like the endless problem of political imperatives impinging on military tactics, right, and goals. Um, but or the role of air power, or whether even the Ukrainian soldiers were trained according to even though they're trained according to NATO manuals. The question is whether the manuals really take into account what's happening. But maybe let's first start with maneuver, and again explaining to myself and our audience. You don't think that's necessarily the case, that maneuver is that across the board when it comes to land warfare and
So I do think the Ukrainian battlefield is a place where where concentration for maneuver has to take place to a certain extent in the open. And on top of that, since the fighting is now more or less constrained to that area across the south of Ukraine, which is historically extremely open, as well as the Donbass region, it's one of those things where you don't necessarily need very many sensors in order to be able to perceive that there is a concentration coming up. Um, if this were taking place in a hillier area or in a more forested area, I believe that the sensors that are picking up that intelligence would be substantially less effective, um, or at least less effective for the purposes of actually shooting things to disrupt them. What has struck me throughout this is that it's not like the Ukrainians and the Russians can't find good targets to hit. If anything, they've been able to hit most of the C2 nodes that as they crop up and come into range. The problem seems to be that after they hit those C2 nodes, it's not like the maneuver stops as a consequence of this. Both sides continue to do what they were going to do. They've learned to militarily adapt to the fact that there's just going to be fragility within their chain of command at various points. So I can imagine that if it's easier for you to concentrate maneuver forces because uh, one side may be able to see you concentrating, but you don't necessarily have the ability to just nullify it, that would be a major problem. For a lot of the strikes that are going on in Ukraine, you're not taking out large quantities of people behind the front lines as you see a concentration point occur. As with the historical norm, the overwhelming number of casualties are coming from artillery as well as minefields. And both of those are relatively short range things. The major advantage that both have is that you can fire quite a lot of artillery rounds or scatter a substantial quantity of mines, such that even if the kill rate of them is not especially high, you're able to actually attrit the enemy side. When you're doing these longer range shootings, uh, attrition is not really your goal, except in terms of how it's impacting the enemy's morale and organization. And I think that's been the major hole in the logic that the Russians adopted following the Syria campaign that has now been exposed. Now, in terms of how maneuver would or would not work again here, the major thing that is going to be required is being able to maneuver in a spot where the enemy is unable to return an appropriate quantity of ordnance to destroy your forces there. And considering how the front has more or less stabilized, everybody knows where bureaucratically to shift the forces around, It's returned to that World War I type logic where you can do concentrations relatively easily. It's just extraordinarily difficult to break out to the point where a maneuver is actually useful again. Um, a lot of these new innovations that we have, like electronic warfare and so forth, yes, these are great for breaking down that degree of organization in doing maneuvers, but I don't think that they are undoing the ability to do them at all. My suspicion remains that if the Ukrainians managed to break through the Surovikin lines at any point in the Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblast, where most of the fighting was going on, it would result subsequently in the ability to do a fair quantity of that sort of encirclement and destroy operations that both the Russians and Ukrainians love doing when they have the opportunity. It does create problems in as much as the commanders who are through the lines won't necessarily know which way to coordinate with with the people on either side of them. But in a war where the reserves are low because up until this point, the idea has been to reduce the literal quantity size of the armies. It's not so much the race against the reserves as it used to historically be, as much as it is being able to get resupplied once you're through and actually working in concert with people around you to get to operational objectives, whether that is defeating the enemy or getting to a specific point to break down the enemy's logistical nodes. But again, this has historically been solved. In 1918, when we start to see major breakthroughs on the front line of the Western Front of World War I, the communications technology, once you moved past the front line and started getting into the rear, either the Germans in Operation Michael or the British and the French during the 100 Days Offensive, is not much better than it would be today if the electronic warfare took out all of our phones as we're going through. Not that they're using phones anymore, but you could. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you have a plan that you understand what your objectives are, as well as what reasonably to expect the units on either side of you to accomplish. You can still coordinate what you're going to do once you've broken through. It's just a matter of extreme training and battle preparation, which I get the very strong impression that on both the Russian and Ukrainian sides, the quality of staff officers has quite improved over the course of this fighting. If anything, it's become almost a fragility for both sides because their quantity has not increased. It's almost certainly decreased rather substantially on both sides, but the quality of the remaining staff officers is much improved. Does that answer what you were looking at, or is there another dimension I left out?
No, sir. I mean, whatever you throw at me, I'll try to put it together later as a more composite picture. But looking at this, I mean, I would remark, but I would ask that any future conflict is probably gonna get those cadres wiped out, those better trained cadres, right? Especially if they do lessons learned or do their homework, which sort of brings you back, right, to the problem of proper mission command and those abilities that you mentioned. And another one is, so as you pointed out, the trend over the last decades, which again was probably also guided by economic considerations, demography, and so on, was to move away from large armies and focus on more agile force and maneuver and ability to blind, especially the US, blind the opponent. Is that over? Is that concept over? I mean, when you look at Poland buying tanks, if you assume that there is any thought in it other than buying shiny toys, it would seem that we're going this way. Is that the case? But also, how do you get away with get around the fact that demographics are not what they are? You have limited age cohorts, right? Economically, you can't really afford this. What do you do? Like, do you have an answer to this?
So I think this was a lot of what we were talking about in the early phase of the war, of how this impacts our visions of the future. One of the big shocks of this war at large is that this is a good old-fashioned mobilization fight, one that we've we certainly thought was not going to happen again.
If I could just interject quickly,
Yes, go
one
ahead.
of the things that bothers us a lot, and we try to figure out going back to, Cold War days, is how do you mobilize population today? How do you really? I mean, you have to break, to a certain extent, you have to break the social contract, right? That existed post 90. Like,
No, you do. And I recall specifically being in a variety of European countries between the annexation of Crimea and the launch of the large scale invasion in 2022. Uh, a lot of discussion of, yes, we have the option to mobilize. We more or less know how to do it. But if we did it, it would destroy the economy so substantially that even if deterrence succeeded and we actually convinced the Russians not to attack us and we're ready to go, the pain would be so extreme that
yeah.
what could we do? It
Reverse
would just make
deterrence
us
by
more vulnerable.
punishment, kind of, in a way. Like, out of
Yeah,
work.
excuse me.
No worries.
Um, the part of the issue that we've run into, and this is a problem that Europe is just going to have generically, is that the industries in the Russian Federation that are driving its economy, which are not many, are not manpower intensive. You can essentially strip out the labor force of Russia, and it will impact the economic performance by maybe 20-25%. Bad, but hardly catastrophic. In the West, the economy being much more diversified is also much more talent dependent. And as a consequence, if you mobilize the Western labor force, turned it into soldiers because you needed it for some reason, I think the economic impact is closer to 50 to 70%, and would hit those. It would hit those people who are not necessarily mobilized just as hard as anything else. I mean, I've been as stunned as anybody else by how much Putin apparently doesn't care about the youth of Russia anymore. Um, Even though this was something that the military was harping on about quite a lot before 2022. There just aren't enough people for us to do large scale mobilization fights. That's why we are innovating in the following ways. Um, so, from the Russian government's perspective, there's just a notion that the value of the object in a Clausewitzian sense of Ukraine is so infinitely high that it doesn't matter if we lose half the country trying to get it. Um, at the same time, from a Ukrainian standpoint, the value of the object of keeping your own country is so high that it doesn't matter if we lose half the country trying to preserve it. So we end up with this place where it appears to be an outlandish clash of interests. From a Polish specific perspective, it's unclear to what extent the Russians starting a fight with Poland are going to be completely invested in it. Whereas there is a substantial sense that Ukraine is a historical part of Russia. I can see the propaganda warfare turning into a specific way to say that Poland, as a representative of NATO, must be destroyed in order it's part of a larger project. I could even, if I squint my eyes harder, even imagine them saying, actually, Warsaw is part of Russia anyway, as we all know for what only 200 years of history or so forth. But or 150, I suppose. Um, but I would expect that there would be much less in political investment on the Russian side into doing a campaign of that nature. Now, how would that impact the literal course of the fighting is now harder to determine. As part of the issue that's going on in the larger world right now is that as the international order is starting to become unglued in a variety of places, there's going to be a lot more opportunity for these small scale fights in which neither side is existentially invested in the conflict.
Mhm, mhm.
And as those things start to crop up, we end up with these three different variables that really start to shake under our feet. The first one, the only one that's necessarily a good one, is the sense of how much one's own capabilities are able to deliver might in like a very classical sense. The second one, as I brought up a couple times already, to what extent do we feel vulnerable or does the opponent feel vulnerable? And ideally, you're trying to make sure that your might is making the other side feel more vulnerable. And finally, there's this perception of how much cost have you already incurred in this. And that largely feeds into sunk cost fallacies and all that fun stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But what's bizarre about this interrelationship is that the cost and that vulnerability dimension are actually in contestation with each other, whereas you would think they're both on just the negative side of a ledger. When the cost that has already been incurred is so high that you don't necessarily perceive your own vulnerability anymore, or you perceive the necessity of continuing to fight in order to avenge the deaths and other things that you've lost in the course of this fighting, then you just are going to continue to reevaluate that the reason why you're fighting is that much more important to continue to move into this. It also starts to lower the degree to which you can be deterred from other things. So, for example, during the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union were intermittently quite worried about the bolt out of the blue nuclear attack. Both sides are just going to launch all their ICBMs one day because Nixon or Brezhnev decides, you know what, it's time to see if we can actually pull this off.
Or they spot an asymmetric advantage, right?
Yes.
That was the problem with technological advancements, right?
Oh, yes. The technical problems were constantly exacerbating this. When we now know that neither side was ever even halfway seriously considering this option. In no small part because under what circumstances do you feel sufficiently vulnerable that it's now the time to start shooting strategic nuclear weapons in a state of peace? Or at least, or even proxy war, you're just not going to get to that point. If, however, you are invested in a war for a considerable period of time in which you have been deterred from using your nuclear weapons because you believe there is more to lose, I think both the value of your nuclear deterrent deteriorates, as well as the other side's perception of their vulnerability to nuclear weapons will lower. So in this specific Ukraine case, if the Ukrainians woke up and found out that one major Ukrainian city, say Kharkov for some reason, is hit by a nuclear weapon, I don't think that that's actually going to change a lot of people's political calculus because they're already invested in a war. If this had happened on February 22nd, like who the heck knows what would have happened? You'd have half the country like becoming genocidal brigands trying to get into Russia and kill everybody that they could, and the other half saying surrender now. Why would we possibly resist against this force?
Sure. So the shock value, the sudden shock value.
As the costs increase, the shock value deteriorates. It also means that vulnerability is harder to perceive.
Yes. Right.
That's the sort of interrelationship that's going to be building up as the world enters into a period where there's going to be more and more low intensity conflict. So, how should a European country adapt to that reality? It's unclear whether or not having a much larger military is going to have the appropriate deterrent value that you want it to have. Having a large military is fantastic for if you're expecting to go on existential campaigns, or if you need to deploy around the world constantly, or if you're expecting to be invaded pretty much at any moment. In Poland's case, I don't think any of those things are actually relevant. The Russians were going to attack Poland. It's mostly going to be in order to create a sense of vulnerability on the other side. The unfortunate bit is that you need to be ready to not only engage the other side back in a way that they feel some harm, but also be ready to negotiate fast.
Yeah, demonstrate. Yeah.
The requirements here are not having a giant military that's going to march to Moscow in the space of 6 months. The requirement here is to be able to make Moscow feel pain within 6 hours, so both sides agree not to continue. I think even in the Ukraine case, had the Ukrainians been able to start like pummeling missiles across Moscow on the first day of the fight, I think there would have been a major ability to de-escalate after about a month or so of the war, after it had become clear the Russians were not going to win the way that they were initially attempting to. Then it would be otherwise. Now, of course, this is going to raise some accusations. Doesn't this sound just like the Douay theory of therefore bomb civilians, and you'll bring the war home, and they'll all recognize that warfare is useless. And we know that that is not how that works. So there is going to be a role for precision here. It's not a question of just bombing apartment buildings. You do need to make sure that you are bombing things that make the state function, but it has to be in a way that's demonstrably limited and with the political intent to disengage rapidly. If you're just going to build a mobilization army because you intend to use it, then the country won't be the same at the end of the fight.
Sure.
You're dependent. You become dependent on whatever the larger fortune of the war is, which there's no way to guarantee.
But okay, so yeah, I have first thing I have to say, because it struck me that the thing about understanding that wars are limited usually, right, and they have a political overriding scheme, right, to them, that they aren't life or death engagements, that everything,
or at least they should be.
At least they should be, yeah, if they are to make any sense. The thing is, and you brought up Poland, the only thing we know, it's again, it goes to show the problems with maturity of our thinking about the world. But also, admittedly, existential wars is the only thing we know, right? It's very deeply ingrained in our idea of wars. Like the US doesn't necessarily, although the US, with the, have to destroy the evil, right? The messianistic aspect to it, that there are some tendencies to go for complete victory. But with us, we have that deep perception ingrained into our understanding of reality, that if we lose a war, we cease to exist, right? That there is, we won't negotiate our status, or our status won't be negotiated, because it's binary. We either win or we die. So in this sense,
an easy way to think through that for just a moment then is, remember that if you're going to fight a total war with unlimited, not necessarily total war, an unlimited aim war, what you need to do is make the other side disinterested in continuing to affiliate itself with whatever you are fighting. So if you're fighting against terrorism, for instance, you need to make the other side just no longer be interested in using terrorism, which you can't really do militarily, as the United States has figured out the hard way. Similarly, as the Russians, the Germans, and the Austrians found out, assimilating Poland the first time and then invading it during the Second World War, you can occupy Poland for 150 years, and Polish people don't stop affiliating themselves with Poland. So there's no way that they're going to sufficiently destroy Polish society such that there is no longer a Polish identity. Yeah, things might get bad, I certainly agree, but I don't think Poland is going away anytime soon.
Which is where you start negotiating, or it becomes, your status becomes negotiable, and you can improve your standing by having, proper military posture, right? And, demonstrating the costs you might impose on others. That's true, but this is, again, I think we're going to come to our grand strategy part of the conversation, which I telegraphed before a bit more, but this is a lesson we'll have to still, fully integrate into our thinking, especially that right now we are, I think the basic idea, when you have like a basic gestalt of what Poland is and how the world functions, is that it is underpinned by unwavering assumption that the US is here, and that the norms that the US has set out, like, you had governing set of ideals and the, Holy Alliance and stuff like that. So the basic assumption here is that those norms will continue, because, and only once you abandon this assumption, you can start to think about the world, where you negotiate your status with Russia, with Germany, and stuff like that. But we'll get to this because this is the one that's been bugging me for a while. But we'll get to this. Another interesting, like a comment of mine to what she said, and Ukrainian reaction to nuclear employment by Russia, even limited, is that it's true what she said, but this only works if you're calling the shots. Because the difference here is between deterrence and coercion and compellence, right? It's very hard to coerce Ukrainians by using force. Usually it doesn't work. Usually terror campaigns, yield opposite result to what you would like, right? The Blitz, didn't really result in Brits, pardon the rhyme here, rolling over, right? But if you have, if you're a client state, if you're a patron, if you have a patron on which you depend, then that, deterrent value, I mean, the patron might be deterred, right? So that's when you're away from the, contest of wills, and rather you depend on somebody else to sponsor you continuously, then those tricks might be more effective. This leverage becomes notable as a impact factor. I mean, if you blow up Kiev, or really blow up a district in Kiev, Ukrainians will just get pretty pissed off, but it won't make them, terminate. But the US,
Yes.
obviously, the messaging is directed at the US, because you cannot expect that what Russians are really telegraphing is, don't expect Marquis de Queensberry and, we move along the escalation ladder in an organized fashion. If you try to do something, we'll not only redo it, but we might jump up a couple more steps in the ladder. And the dynamic of that escalation is unclear whether it can be contained, right? So you better terminate now. And that seems to be more effective. Like, if you look at the studies of deterrent versus coercive threats never really work. It's shelling as well, like going back to basics. Deterrence via, threatening to have an escalation dominance or control and threatening further escalation, it's usually quite effective.
And here's where I think we can come up with at least specific prescriptions for Poland here. Because as you say, if you shoot a whole bunch of missiles at the other side and all you're doing is hitting wherever the missiles land, that's more likely than not going to just make people angry. When the actual communication you're trying to put out is not to demoralize the enemy population, it should be to demoralize the enemy's government's confidence that they're able to continue fighting. If that fails, then there is this serious risk that everything is going to continue to escalate, because the people will now be riled up to actually support this war. Under those circumstances, though, the targeting does not become, therefore, shoot more people. The targeting should, therefore, become, how do you most efficiently destroy the enemy's army ability to actually do stuff to you? And so, from my perspective, I don't think that there's going to be much good in actually trying to get out there and occupy Russian territory. And historically, it just doesn't work. What you need to be able to do instead is make sure that any Russian forces that are coming at Poland or are in Poland, you have just the easiest way of making it impossible for them to actually stay there. So the military you're looking for is the one that's going to cause the most damage to forces moving in the theater you're looking at as possible. If that involves using weapon systems that, from the perspective of your patron, it don't look like a proportional response, that will get their attention. I don't know to what extent there is a predictable way to get a response out of any patron, though, other than if you make them angry. If you make Moscow angry and you're a Soviet patron, they'll invade you and then reinstate whatever government they want to. From a U.S. perspective, they wouldn't do that. I think there's an equal chance that the United States would take the perspective that you are now being unhelpful, which is a serious debate going on at the moment between Israel and Hamas, is that there's a large segment of the United States population that is thoroughly disgusted with what Israel is doing. I would say that a lot of those people were already antipathetic to Israel before October 7th. And there's a growing subsection of the politics here that says that Israel's just been doing whatever it wants with free money that we've been giving them for no good reason for a while. And that's something that they're going to have to specifically deal with in terms of U.S. politics. Whereas with Poland and other forces within NATO, there's much less of that perception. If anything, Americans tend to view Europeans as underinvesting in their own defense, which would set up almost an opposite response. I would conceive of the American right saying, "Well, isn't that what they deserve if they're not willing to defend themselves?" And the American left saying, "Well, actually, we've got to do something about this," because for the longest time we've been the reason why they're not defending themselves appropriately. It's excuse me. It's practically impossible to predict literally how that would come about, but it is one of those things that people outside the United States need to be aware of how the commitment to the American empire is very much on the wane. And I think a lot of this, the best way to explain this to an international audience is that since the end of the Cold War, put it this way, in the 1970s and 1980s, if you were going on a mission around NATO countries in order to do whatever business there was to do, you had to buy a phrase book in order to speak the 12 words of Dutch you need in order to do whatever business you're doing in Amsterdam. Even if everybody on your professional team speaks English, you needed to learn at least a tiny amount of Dutch in order to talk to people at the hotel or order food or whatever it is that you need to do on the way. Now, if I fly to the Netherlands, everybody speaks English, no matter how poorly or well. And it's convinced a lot of Americans that the rest of the world functions a lot like America does. So why can't they get their crap together like the United States apparently has? We started off as a tiny little country, then now we control the world. Shouldn't the rest of the world be able to do the same thing? And since there is that perception about basically everywhere, including countries that just aren't functional, places where there's not a strong tradition of governance in the system that currently exists, that ignorance is making a lot of Americans feel as though it's not worthwhile continuing these commitments. I do think that there is a larger subsection of the American population that believes that NATO is important than certain other countries. For instance, we've talked at Strategy and Future before about the importance of Australia and Japan. I suspect that Americans actually know much less about how important Australia and Japan are to U.S. strategy than NATO is, even though comparatively Australia and Japan are substantially more important to continuing projection of a U.S. power than even the United Kingdom is in Europe. So it's a perception game. It is going to require additional institutional knowledge of how America does or does not function inside of Europe. The big three things that have changed. First, you don't need the phrase books anymore. Second, the U.S. Army used to have every single one of its soldiers serve in West Germany at some point or another, and that hasn't been true in over an entire career's worth of being in the U.S. Army. And third, the other thing I just forgot. The other thing that has changed is the diaspora communities from Europe in the United States are much less strong politically than they used to be. During the Cold War, there were plenty of Polish American communities, Slovak American communities, Serbian American communities that could be used in order to create pressures within the US government to favor certain policies. Those groups still exist, but they do not command the votes that they did even in the 90s during the NATO debates, the NATO expansion debates. So that's something that awareness is needed outside of this country.
So I must ask, Nick, maybe the fourth thing that has changed is that, because you spoke of things like, the fear of entrapment of the United States, right, by its allies, and into conflicts which might escalate into a very nasty affair, but at the same time, which are not in the interest of the United States, where it's more like it does like engaging in those conflicts, or even entertaining the risk of entering them, is the cost effect ratio is bad. So the question, another fourth factor that you could consider, and again, you spoke of changing attitudes in the U.S. society, but also if you look, starting with Barack Obama, there were tensions, or at least attempts by Obama, right? Some desire to disengage to one extent. So the question is whether the justification, and again, I'm saying, something that's anathema to the polls for a good reason, and a lot of those countries who depend on UN security. But perhaps it becomes harder and harder to justify the current US grand strategy of primacy, that, justification of continued military presence it's becoming difficult to argue for it, and not just argue for it, it's also physically becoming prohibitively expensive and difficult and risky to do.
So there is what has changed here is that the political movement that is against the empire is a lot better organized than it historically was. I don't think it's pulling in as much of the vote as they think the people involved with that movement believe they are, but it's certainly no longer the shambolic, occasionally Ron Paul will say something
Or
type thing,
Pat Buchanan,
even
right?
10
Yeah.
years ago. But the notion that the United States shuts down silly things that its allies are trying to do, that's not new. Like the Suez Crisis is like the moment in which the British and the French Empire realized, oh yeah, our patron's not going to deal with these shenanigans anymore. And I think the high points of the tensions in the Obama administration were precisely that. Once again, Britain and France wanted to do something in North Africa, and unlike the Suez Crisis, they physically couldn't do it. And they still tried and failed. And the United States had this time came and bailed them out for reasons that Obama still is not happy about. I do think there is a certain extent to which the prestige that redounds to the United States by having this empire is sufficient to keep the status quo in place. The bad news for other countries is that also means as soon as you start doing something stupid from an American perspective, that is going to incite a lot of second guessing about why the United States is backing this country in the first place. Israel's just such an exceptional one because the institutional memory from 50 years ago when Joe Biden was young is just so strongly pro-Israel that it's going to be quite the shock when that finally ebbs. Say we're a better example out there. Something like Turkey, I think, would be a good one to look at, as there is, within the U.S. elite community, substantial pride in the fact that the United States had the foresight to make sure that Turkey was brought in as a formal U.S. ally, because if it wasn't, so many more problems would be infinitely worse than they currently are. Amongst the broader U.S. community, they don't usually think about Turkey in that way. They usually don't think about Turkey at all, except as a potential tourism destination. And then they will occasionally hear about how they're fighting a war against the Kurds, or they're fighting the Armenians, or hostile to the Armenians, or are involved in whatever war crimes are going on in northern Syria. And then they'll see in the next sentence of the newspaper that Turkey is a U.S. ally, and they become irked at it. But the United States fundamentally doesn't need to do anything about it. And therefore, it's like, why are they a U.S. ally? This is really inconvenient. Should we do anything about it? Nah, I don't really care. If Poland is starting World War III, or even if the United States public becomes convinced that Poland is starting World War III, I think that backlash will be at least as strong as the backlash currently going on against Israel, and probably to the point that we would be looking for a way to de-escalate. De-escalate, and as much as the United States would disavow the fact that we have anything to do with this activity going on, and possibly even communicate to Moscow that if you need to punish Warsaw for some reason, have at it, but don't invade them. I don't. I think that is something that's probably more specific to our perceptions of allies in Europe and Africa. I think in Asia it is a somewhat different story because there is a fixation among the U.S. public with China, and I, for one, believe that if the Chinese were going to invade Taiwan, unless the Taiwanese government gives up immediately because they perceive their vulnerability as just unaccountably high, it would be a months-long process during which it would be impossible for the United States to not come up with some reason why it's either not doing anything or else decide to intervene. But that awareness that China's out there and a potential threat is quite different. I think there still is a perception of the Soviet Union collapsed. Why does anybody take Russia seriously? And then when they failed to occupy Kyiv relatively quickly, that confirmed a lot of biases amongst ordinary people that Russia actually was past its sell-by date as a world power.
But those arguments make perfect sense, but only at a point where the U.S. fundamentally reevaluates what is in its interest, right? If it assumes that its interests are served well by preventing conflicts globally, but especially in those three key theaters, which you kind of mentioned, which is Europe, Middle East, East Asia. If it assumes that it's in its interest to still be directly present or intervene and it serves their interest, then yes. But if it comes to a conclusion that at this point in time, attempting to continue with this strategy will inevitably, or it's very risky because it's likely to lead to a direct war, direct engagement with a major power, for no good reason, really, especially in Europe and the Middle East, because there isn't a single. Because again, if you look at whether it's onshore balancing, continuous presence, right, or primacy, or offshore balancing, the idea that the rationale for it is that you prevent emergence, right, the basic thing, emergence of a regional hegemon that could theoretically threaten the U.S. But you don't see that. I mean, there is no way in hell anybody dominates Europe, right? This isn't going to happen. There is no even need for balancing here because there's, the powers balance themselves out, and in due time they will figure out, either via local coalitions or some grand agreement, how to settle things. And if they don't, that's fine for the US as well. This isn't, again, if you redefine and accept a more narrow definition of what's in the US existential interests, then war happening in Europe is not the end of the world, as long as it's not the Germans about to conquer everything from Lisbon to Urals, or there isn't Iran about to dominate the entire Middle East, but there is Turkey there is Saudis. In Europe you have, what is Russia? They failed to take Kyiv. So there, if you look at it this way, there isn't a good reason other than inertia for the US to continue with its current grand strategy, right? Asia is different, might be different, but those two theaters.
So it is definitely the case that in Washington, there is literally zero discussion about what our priorities in Europe are, short of holding NATO together, possibly even improving relations with the European Union as its own entity. That is almost the entire list of things that people in Washington think about when they're talking about reevaluating long-term U.S. strategy in Europe. So in the event that we did start to withdraw or take NATO less seriously or whatever, there is no consideration whatsoever about, under these circumstances, we favor the Germans, under this circumstance, we favor Sweden, all that fun stuff. No, there's zero discussion, no awareness. Mm-hmm. To the extent that we are aware at all that there are debates among these countries, it's coming from newspapers. And a lot of it is because that it's not really a security question, with the exception of the French, which, since we know that nobody's paying much attention to Macron, and Macron's probably the most committed to this that the French have been in decades, that we just don't need to worry about Europe finding its own voice. In no small part because once they start doing that, the British will start acceding to us. But at the same time, all of those things are leading to just a complete atrophy of interest in terms of what Europe is there as a U.S. ally for. With the actual answers within the bureaucracy is that Europe is a very useful way of keeping military infrastructure and bureaucracy functioning for doing worldwide force projection. And so long as DoD continues to go to various meetings and say, yeah, actually our bases in Germany are useful for the following reasons, and a lot of that is like transitioning people through, that is the sufficient one answer against the wind that will hold everything in place through just the stability of bureaucracy over time. I don't think we're approaching a point at which there is a critical mass in the United States that just wants to disengage from Europe for the sake of it. In no small part because among the educated people who would be able to coordinate that message, there is still a strong perception that a lot of the countries that the United States ended up fighting around the world in its most climactic wars were U.S. allies or at least U.S. friends beforehand. And so something went wrong that we let them slip away.
Talk about sunk cost, right?
It's different from sunk cost, because sunk cost is like, we've already done this and therefore we have to continue. This perception is very much of we screwed up somewhere and this forced us to fight in a way we didn't want to when this could have been solved. That tends to be the view amongst educated Americans looking at history. So for the prime example, obviously, in World War I, Japan was a U.S. ally, or the United States was an associated power to an alliance which Japan was a part. And then in World War II, Japan was one of our main enemies. Most obvious example, there are plenty of other ones where it's like, yeah, at various points, they were our friends. How do we screw this up? I think that as a consequence of that, there's just very little interest in disengaging from a variety of U.S. allies, even when they are misbehaving. Now, at the moment, this possibly could change, but I don't see it changing anytime soon. There is a very strong perception that Putin is just the troublemaker in Europe. And so to any extent that Europe is going to get itself into a war, this is Russia's fault. And therefore, the perception that we are defending victims in Europe is sufficient that I really don't see there being much political will to disengage, even among the most activist anti-empire people out there. The activist anti-empire politicians, if they were to gain power, might start closing bases in Europe in order to bring people home. But I don't think they would disavow NATO. If Russia collapses into its own miasma again, like the 1990s, I think there would potentially be a path to them arguing, and therefore now is the time to shut NATO down, because we know that NATO created Putin, the Putin problem, as we understood it in 2014 and 2022. However wrong that perception may be, there will be a constituency that says that. But so long as Russia remains more or less as it is today, a troublemaker, even if it's not a very effective troublemaker, there is a view to think of Europeans as deserving victims to defend. So I wouldn't worry about it in the short term. And honestly, if Russia dissolves, the opportunities that Poland is going to be able to exploit really redouble. So there's be a nice opportunity to rethink about Poland's position in the world. We can discuss separately whether or not the imagination amongst the Polish leadership is there in order to take advantage of the fact that the global situation would be changing rather dramatically around them. Mm-hmm. But it's one of those matters where, under the circumstances where I imagine the United States disengaging from Europe, it's probably going to be within a much more benign, broader context. The only exception, but it is a major exception, is what if the United States starts to fall apart for its own internal reasons? Mm-hmm. I have now been back in the United States for 2 years. I'm in Rhode Island, which is not the hotbed of political difficulties that it was in the late 18th century or the early 19th century. The history of Rhode Island is weird. I don't see mass civic unrest coming.
Hmm.
I do see a lot of reformulations about how things are going to work. And I also believe that the degree to which Americans in different sections of the country don't understand each other is going to exacerbate. But I don't even see the beginnings of this solidifying into we're now going to start doing mass war against other people.
Hmm.
There will continue to be violence from guns. There will continue to be crazy people forming militias out in the corners, which is generally a bad thing. But none of these groups are getting to even 0.1% of the power that the even state governments can mobilize against them.
As long as they
So,
aren't well regulated.
as long as they aren't well regulated, we are. Even if Trump is reelected president, I really don't see this all falling apart. Now, if Trump is reelected president, I think he's got a lot of spite he has to get out against Europe that is going to create a whole bunch of short-term problems. But again, so long as there's electoral politics here, that means that the Democrats are going to become much more pro-Europe than they have historically been. And so that will just become a shifting a shifting machine. And I do think that the US bureaucracy is of parallel strength to the Russian bureaucracy in 1910 telling the Tsar that he can't sign an alliance with Germany when the Kaiser offers him one,
Mhm.
even though the Tsar wanted to at the time. So I am relative to most people who researches European security from an American perspective less worried about Trump than others, which might make me look horribly naive in 3 years' time. But that's certainly my perception sitting here in the United States.
But if I could push back on what you said a little bit, is that it would appear to me you give a lot of agency to the United States and the decisions US makes, but those aren't, you, only, it's not only the US that calls the shots. There is, US cannot all of a sudden negate gravity. It cannot all of a sudden negate the fact that you have that it's in relative terms, not necessarily in absolute terms. Although even when you look at, for example, life expectancy in the U.S., it's dropping, but in relative terms, U.S. is declining. It's very hard to move away from this conclusion, and at a certain time, it won't be the decision of the United States. It will be made elsewhere. It would be impossible. It will become impossible or prohibitively expensive or dangerous for the United States to try to retain the status quo, which is another thing. The problem with this is that I can't imagine anybody, whether it's a state or a dominant organization within some system, willingly giving power away, right? This almost never happens.
And that's the answer I'm going to give you. Yes, on a relative scale of the long term, the United States' power potential is declining. The way that we get to the point where the United States literally can't maintain the empire is similar to how the British and the French Empire ended. They win or lose a major war,
Yeah.
and then no longer have the resources or interest to keep things up. So yes, if there's a major war between the United States and China, even if the United States wins, I think there will be some serious reevaluation of to what extent our commitments around the rest of the world are valid,
Mhm.
and to how much do we have to contract. So to a certain extent, yes, China does have a vote there, but that will require an earthquake of the size of a major war to trigger. In
Nuclear.
100 years' time, yes, I think if there's no war for the next 100 years, well, hooray, the United States apparently has succeeded. But at that point, you probably do need to reevaluate, is the United States still a superpower if all of the trend lines continue? But if every single trend line that we see today continues for 100 straight years, then this is going to be one exceptional century ahead of us.
Sure. I was actually thinking about this because again, this is the most tragic circumstance you can imagine for Poland, US winding down. or moving away to offshore balancing, which we still in Poland like to think that even if you move to offshore balancing, you're going to have to invest in one big player in Europe, which I think stems from misunderstanding what offshore balancing is. But nevertheless, I thought about three scenarios, and one is that major conflict. But the problem with that major conflict with China is, it's like that major conflict with the Soviets. It's quite likely, it's uncomfortably probable that it will go nuclear, and controlling that escalation dynamic is going to be difficult, which, it's like kind of all bets off scenario. The other one I was thinking, I actually wanted to ask you, what do you think about this, is breaking US perception, or perception of if not omnipotence, then preponderance over a marginal conflict. And it's not even the perception that the allies will get out of it, like engaging, for example, in Middle East and getting really pushed back, or having, economic problems that spread to home or something like this, or some instability. I'm not talking about, the country breaking up, but second order effects really shaking the US up, and then the perception it would give to the US society and US decision-making circles that this isn't, so a marginal war that is being lost in a bad way, and that impacting the US perception of the world. And the third one is the least likely, I think, which would be probably wise from the US standpoint. I'm getting rid of those restrainer ideas are rubbing off of me. It's not good. But US basically, in Poland, we call it running way forward, which is, anticipating the trends and moving first and agreeing to power sharing, or just winding down. But again, this wouldn't be a normal logic that entities in power follow, right?
So I'm afraid we're coming to the end of the time I have available to
we
talk.
Are running. Yeah.
For each of those three scenarios, the first one I more or less agree with you. There's a whole load of unpredictabilities about how the US and China de-escalate a conflict as soon as one starts. That's a big discussion for another day, I'm afraid, but I basically agree with the dynamics you've got. The second scenario, losing a marginal war, I think that would actually convince the United States that it has to double down on the stuff that works. Throughout the global war on terror, things fell apart. The example everybody's kept throwing out, it worked in Germany and Japan, and it convinced the government to reinvest into making sure that we kept NATO and Japan as US allies. So it would have to be a pretty substantial loss, at least at the scale of Vietnam. And even there, NATO wobbled for a couple of years, but we were back in reality within 5 years of that happening. Jimmy Carter was debating withdrawing from South Korea at various points, and ultimately did not. It's a period of history probably worth studying a bit more in Poland, honestly. But it ultimately did not have a major bureaucratic effect, in no small part because the military said this is just part of the institutional culture that we have. And in addition to which, the deterrence here has worked, even if it failed in Vietnam. So I'd be inclined to say that there is a chance, but I would put it at less than 50% chance that peripheral theater causing a major reevaluation of U.S. strategy would then result in cutting Europe loose. The third option of getting ahead of the trend, there is some precedent here. Not in the United States. The best example I can think of is the French Empire setting up all the currency unions in Africa a couple of years ahead of them leaving, because they could see, we're going to be kicked out of here before too long, so we're going to set up a whole bunch of things to maintain post-colonial imperial presence. And a lot of those are only being undone now, 60 years after the actual independence was conferred. But again, this is taking place in the context of the French knew they were going to lose. They knew that they cared about these places in Equatorial Africa less than Algeria, or Indochina for that matter. And after World War II, when they have to fundamentally realize that their resources are not up to maintaining a global empire. In the U.S. case, again, also from that late 1970s period, the Panama Canal Treaty could be seen as one of those things of conceding the resources for actually running the canal, but that wasn't a security threat. That was more of a undoing imperialism problems and image management sort of thing. Um, there's really not many examples of this. Like there was the Marshall Plan, to a certain extent, was designed to reinvigorate Europe's ability to do things, and then ended up having the effect of major European sympathy for the United States. So huge boon in the long term. But it's sort of it's been sometimes viewed as a false choice in the United States of we could have just annexed France and made it a separate section of the country. Like that was never seriously considered for a whole variety of reasons. I don't see any reason why the United States would do that at the moment, if only because those restrainers that you mentioned don't win elections. If that changes for some reason, and perhaps there will be a generational shift, then we need to seriously reevaluate that possibility. But for right now, it's those people who say we can have everything who win elections. I would say that I would also say that I don't think that's a uniquely American problem, but that is just the dynamic that currently exists. So we'll have to come back and look at them. But those three scenarios are definitely things to bear in mind.
Fair enough. Nick, I don't know if you have time for one final question. Gonna be a quick one, easy to answer.
Then we can do a nice quick one.
I
would like to come back inside.
You're gonna hate me for it. So your prediction for 24, Ukraine, stalemate, some sort of temporary truce, Russia steamrolls Ukraine, implosion.
I'm standing by my prediction that I gave out, I think in March 2022. This is going to be a 5 to 7 year war. Neither side feels like it's close to the end. I do think that the character of the war is possibly going to start shifting. I'm hearing a lot more rumblings about the Ukrainian military being unhappy, but the Ukrainian military has been unhappy for years. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that. I will also say, if the Ukrainian military starts to implode tomorrow, which I don't think is going to happen, but if it starts to implode tomorrow, I don't think the Russians would actually advance very far before they would just outrun their ability to state create. Would they be trying to fill that vacuum? Yes. Would they be progressively expanding? Probably yes, at least to the Dnieper River. But I don't think if Ukraine starts to fall apart because Zelensky is actually a horrible person, which I'm not saying, I'm just hypothetically here, then I don't think it's suddenly going to turn into a Russian rout within even a month of that happening. Again, I hope I don't have to be proven wrong on that, but I am standing by my original prediction that it's going to be 5 to 7 years of a very terrible time to be in Ukraine, and increasingly Russia, for that matter, too.
Sure. Well, that's not what I wanted to say. It's a great note to end, but it really isn't. But fantastic. And
if it proves that I'm right, then it's not the worst possible note.
One way to look at it. Great. Thank you so much, Nick. We hope to host you again soon. Thank you so much.
Yep, thank you.